A deep roar echoes from a stone labyrinth, the sound of a monster waiting in the dark. This is the Minotaur, one of mythology's most famous terrors. But this creature is more than a simple beast. It is a tragic figure, born from a shocking chain of divine curses, broken oaths, and stunning human folly. Today, we will uncover its full, twisted origin story from the very beginning. You will learn the complete saga of the gods, kings, and heroes whose choices created and ultimately confronted this horror. We are going back to the start, to a story filled with betrayal, divine punishment, and a maze of deadly secrets. What makes a monster and who is truly responsible for its creation? Our story begins not in the labyrinth, but on the sun-drenched shores of ancient Crete. A new king, Minos, had just taken the throne, but his claim to power was not entirely secure. To silence any doubters and prove his rule was favored by the gods themselves, Minos turned to the most powerful deity of the seas. He stood before the crashing waves and offered a desperate prayer to Poseidon. He asked for a sign, a public miracle that would show all of Crete that he was the rightful, God-chosen king. And Poseidon answered. From the frothing depths of the ocean emerged a creature of such breathtaking beauty it seemed carved from moonlight and sea foam. It was a bull, but unlike any ever seen on land. Its coat was a brilliant, flawless white, its muscles coiled like waves, and its horns gleamed like polished ivory. This was no ordinary animal. It was a direct manifestation of Poseidon's power, a living symbol of divine favor sent from the god's own realm. The message was clear and magnificent. The god of the sea endorsed King Minos. In return for this celestial endorsement, a sacred contract was formed. The bull, a gift from the god, was meant to be a temporary loan. The understood ritual was simple. Minos would show the bull to his people, secure his kingship, and then sacrifice the magnificent creature back to Poseidon, returning the god's property with honor and gratitude. This sacrifice would complete the pact, sealing the bond between the mortal king and the immortal god. It was a transaction of faith, a test of humility. The bull's very presence was a blessing, but its intended fate was the key to maintaining that blessing. Yet as Minos gazed upon the stunning animal, a dangerous thought took root. How could he possibly kill something so perfect, so unique? To sacrifice it would mean losing this tangible proof of the god's love forever. Greed, that very human flaw, began to whisper in the king's ear. He convinced himself that such a magnificent prize was too valuable to give back. Perhaps the gods would not mind, perhaps he could keep it. In an act of staggering arrogance, King Minos broke the divine contract. He hid the celestial bull among his own herds and sent a different, ordinary bull to the altar for sacrifice. He believed he could deceive a god. This single decision, this betrayal of a sacred oath, would unleash a chain of consequences far more terrible than he could ever imagine. For the gods do not take broken promises lightly, and Poseidon's revenge would be both cruel and creatively perfect. Poseidon, of course, was not fooled. The god of the sea watched as his sacred bull was led away to a common pasture, and a lesser beast was slaughtered in its name. To the ancient Greeks, an oath was not just a promise, it was a sacred bond that tied the mortal world to the divine. Breaking such a vow was an act of profound hubris, a declaration that one's own desires were above the laws of gods and men, and the deity Minos had chosen to cheat was perhaps the worst possible choice. Poseidon was not a calm, forgiving god. His domain was the tempest, the earthquake, the unpredictable and crushing power of the deep. His anger was as vast and turbulent as the ocean itself. Minos had not merely broken a deal, he had insulted the very source of his kingdom's power and his own legitimacy. The punishment would need to be fitting, a lesson in divine justice that would echo through the ages. It would not be a simple bolt of lightning or a swallowed ship. Poseidon's vengeance would be far more subtle and far more cruel. He would turn Minos' own household against him. He would transform the king's greatest pride, his lineage and his queen, into the source of his deepest shame. The instrument of this revenge would be Pasiphae, Minos' wife. In a move that blurred the line between curse and dark magic, Poseidon did not strike her down. Instead, he inflamed within her a terrible and unnatural passion. The goddess Aphrodite is sometimes said to have been involved, twisting love into something monstrous. Pasiphae, a queen of noble birth, found herself consumed by a desperate, obsessive longing for the very object of her husband's greed, the magnificent white bull. This was no ordinary infatuation. It was a divine madness, a compulsion planted by a god's wrath, making her desire the impossible. Imagine the torment of the queen, living in a palace that had become her prison, haunted by a yearning she could never fulfill and could never confess. The bull was a beast, an animal, separated from her not just by species but by the very order of nature. Yet the curse made that impossible union the sole focus of her existence. This left her with an agonizing question. How does a queen, under the watchful eyes of a court and a guilty husband, approach a sacred bull kept in the royal herds? The solution would require ingenuity, deception, and the help of a craftsman whose name would become synonymous with brilliant, terrible invention. The stage was now set for the next step in the tragedy, where human ingenuity would be used to circumvent natural law, all under the shadow of a god's wrath. The queen's torment was a masterpiece of divine malice. Poseidon's fury did not manifest as a storm or an earthquake upon Crete. Instead, it invaded the most private sanctum of the king's power, his own home, and twisted the heart of his queen. Pasiphae, once a figure of dignity and grace, became a prisoner of a desire so unnatural it defied all reason. This was the core of Poseidon's poetic justice. Minos had coveted a divine object, placing his own greed above sacred law. So, the god would make that coveted object the center of a scandal that would shatter the king's family and mock his royal authority. The magnificent white bull, a symbol of Minos' stolen power, was transformed into an instrument of profound humiliation. The punishment targeted the very things a king was meant to protect: his lineage, his honor, and the sanctity of his marriage. By inflaming Pasiphae with this impossible passion, Poseidon ensured that Minos' prized possession would become a source of eternal shame, a living reminder that no mortal, not even a king, could deceive the gods without consequence. The royal household, meant to be a beacon of order, now festered with a secret chaos. How does a queen live with such a curse? Every glance from her window toward the royal herds, every sound of the bull, was a fresh agony. She was bound by a divine compulsion to seek the unthinkable, while her position and sanity demanded she hide it. This internal conflict, this divine madness inflicted upon an innocent woman, shows the terrifying creativity of Greek divine punishment. The gods did not merely destroy, they corrupted, turning love into obsession and a royal marriage into a gilded cage for a shared, unspeakable secret. The stage was set, but the mechanics of this tragedy required a human architect. Trapped within this divine torment, Pasiphae faced a choice that was no choice at all. She could succumb to the madness consuming her, or she could seek a way to fulfill the cursed desire and perhaps find some release from its grip. In her desperation, she turned to the one man in all of Crete whose mind could engineer the impossible, the legendary artisan Daedalus. He was not a native of the island, but an exile, a genius who had fled his home in Athens under a dark cloud and found refuge in the court of King Minos. His skills were unparalleled, a master of architecture, sculpture, and mechanics, a man who could bend wood, metal, and stone to his will. To the desperate queen, he represented the only possible solution to an unsolvable problem. We must see her plea not as an act of wickedness, but as the frantic act of a woman poisoned by a god's wrath. Imagine the unbearable shame of that confession, whispered in secrecy to a craftsman, admitting a longing that defied nature itself. She was a queen, and yet she was begging for a means to deceive a bull. Daedalus, bound by his position as a servant of the royal house and perhaps moved by her profound distress, accepted the terrible commission. His genius, which should have been used to build beautiful temples or clever toys, was now tasked with facilitating a monstrous deception. He set to work not with malice, but with the focused mind of a problem solver presented with a unique and dreadful challenge. The solution he crafted was a feat of both artistry and dark ingenuity. He constructed a hollow framework of wood, shaped with astonishing realism into the form of a graceful, life-sized cow. Over this wooden skeleton, he stretched the fresh hide of a real cow, ensuring the look and even the smell would be perfect, but the true brilliance and the horror lay in the mechanics. He designed the structure so that Pasiphae could climb inside through a hidden opening. The interior was crafted to hold her in a specific position, and the whole apparatus was placed on small, silent wheels so it could be moved into the royal meadow. This was not a statue, it was a vehicle of deception, a wooden shell that would allow the queen to hide her humanity and present only the convincing form of a beast. Think of the moment she first entered that construction, the smell of fresh hide and sawdust, the confinement of the dark interior, the final surrender of her royal dignity to the gears of a machine built for a single, tragic purpose. With this creation, Daedalus did not break the curse. He simply provided the tool that would allow it to reach its horrifying conclusion. The stage was now set for the birth of a monster, an event that would forever stain the legacy of a king and a kingdom. The wooden cow stood in the meadow, a silent monument to a terrible need. Inside its dark, confined space, Pasiphae waited, her heart pounding against the slats of her own deception. The air was thick with the scent of fresh hide and her own fear. Then came the sound, the heavy, rhythmic tread of hooves on earth, as the magnificent white bull, the very symbol of her husband's sin, approached the convincing decoy. What followed was a moment of profound violation, a grotesque pantomime orchestrated by a god's anger and executed by human hands. The queen, hidden within the artifice, experienced a union that shattered the natural order, a direct consequence of the broken oath that had brought the bull to Crete in the first place. This was not an act of love or even desire in any human sense. It was the fulfillment of a divine curse, a cruel punchline to Poseidon's joke. When it was over and Pasiphae emerged from the wooden shell, she carried with her more than just the memory of shame. She carried a new and growing horror within her. The Queen of Crete was pregnant. Back within the gilded walls of the palace, a different kind of labyrinth began to form. As the months passed, Pasiphae's condition became impossible to hide, but its nature was a secret that choked the entire court. The usual joy surrounding a royal pregnancy was replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Whispers slithered through the corridors. How could a queen carry a child that was not her husband's? And what? The servants dared to wonder in hushed tones if the father was not a man at all. The truth was a poison that infected the household. King Minos, the author of this disaster through his own greed, now faced the living proof of his folly growing in his own wife's womb. His rage and humiliation must have been a tempest, but so too was his fear. This was a scandal that could unravel his kingdom, a divine punishment made flesh. He could not expose it, yet he could not escape it. The palace, once a symbol of his power, became a prison of shared silence, every glance between the king and queen heavy with the unspoken truth. Pasiphae herself lived in a state of suspended terror, feeling the life inside her quicken, knowing with each movement that what she carried was alien, a being born from a wooden machine and a god's wrath. The anticipation of the birth was not about waiting for a prince or princess. It was about waiting to see the shape of their collective punishment. What would this child of deception and divinity look like? The answer, when it finally came, would force the king to make another fateful decision, one that would require the genius of Daedalus once more, not to facilitate a horror but to contain it. The moment of birth arrived, and with it the full shape of the divine punishment was revealed. The infant was a living contradiction, a being that defied all categories. He had the soft, vulnerable body of a human baby, but rising from his shoulders was the unmistakable head of a bull, complete with a tiny muzzle, budding horns, and large, bewildered eyes. This was no symbolic monster. This was a tangible, breathing child of two worlds, and his existence tore at the very fabric of nature. In a fleeting attempt to normalize the horror, to cling to some thread of legacy, the child was given a name, Asterion, meaning starry one, after Minos' own stepfather. It was a name that spoke of the heavens, of nobility and light, a desperate wish placed upon a creature born of darkness and deceit. For Pasiphae, this was her son. Despite the shocking circumstances of his conception, a maternal instinct, twisted by tragedy but no less powerful, took hold. She saw the infant Asterion, not just the monster. She likely insisted on caring for him, on nursing him, on wrapping him in blankets within the deepest, most secret rooms of the palace. For a short, fragile time, there might have been a grotesque semblance of normalcy, a mother tending to an infant who was at his core helpless. But this illusion shattered with terrifying speed. As Asterion grew from a swaddled infant to a toddler, his true nature erupted. The human body housed instincts that were entirely bestial. He did not learn to speak, he learned to roar. His play was not with toys, but with raw, destructive strength. Most horrifying of all, he developed a craving that could not be satisfied by royal kitchens or a mother's milk. He craved raw flesh. The stories say he became carnivorous, his bull's head demanding a diet that reflected his monstrous half. The gentle child was gone, replaced by a creature of unpredictable and dangerous violence. The palace, already a prison of secrets, now held a captive that threatened to break free. The servants tasked with his care risked their lives. The walls that hid his cries of infancy could not contain the bellows of a growing beast. King Minos faced his ultimate dilemma. This was by blood a child of his royal house, a grandson of the sun god Helios through Pasiphae. Yet it was also an abomination, a walking scandal that consumed meat and threatened to consume his kingdom's stability. He could not kill Asterion, for that would be kinslaying, a crime against the gods and family, but he could not allow the creature to be seen or to roam free. The initial attempts at hiding and care had failed. The problem of Asterion was no longer about concealment, it was about containment. The king needed a permanent solution, a prison from which the Starry One, now truly becoming the Minotaur, the bull of Minos, could never escape. And for that, he would once again call upon the genius of Daedalus, demanding an invention far greater than a wooden cow, a maze with no exit. The king's command was absolute. Daedalus, the architect of the queen's deception, was now ordered to design its permanent consequence. He was to create a prison, but not a simple cage of iron bars or a dungeon with a locked door. King Minos demanded something far more final, a structure that would not just hold the Minotaur, but erase him from the world, a tomb for a living secret. The shame of the royal family needed to be buried in stone, and the genius of Daedalus was the only shovel deep enough to dig that grave. So the craftsman set to work, and what he conceived was a masterpiece of psychological terror made physical. He designed the Labyrinth. Its location was beneath the very seat of Minos' power, deep under the great palace of Knossos. This was a powerful symbolic act, placing the monster at the literal foundation of the kingdom, a hidden corruption supporting the glittering halls above. Daedalus did not build a confusing garden hedge or a puzzle of walls in a field. This was a vast subterranean complex carved from cold, unyielding stone. Think of it not as a maze you could see from above, but as an endless, winding intestine of the earth itself. The passages were narrow and high, twisting back on themselves in loops and dead ends that felt identical. There were no landmarks, no windows, no source of light except what little filtered down from the entrance far above. The design exploited a fundamental human and perhaps bestial fear, the terror of absolute disorientation. Every corner turned revealed another identical corridor. Every hopeful path led only to a blank wall. The sound of your own footsteps would echo mockingly around you, seeming to come from every direction at once. The genius of the labyrinth was that it was a trap for the mind first and the body second. It was built not to be solved, but to be endured until madness or starvation took you. Its fame spread quickly across the ancient world. It became the ultimate symbol of the inescapable. To be sent into the labyrinth was a death sentence with a slow, terrifying clock. And at its silent, dark heart, the Minotaur waited. The beast that was once called Asterion now had a home worthy of its myth, a stone puzzle with a monster as its only prize. The king's shame was sealed away, but such a terrible secret, locked in so ingenious a vault, never truly stays buried. It demands a key, and in mythology, a locked door always attracts a hero. The final journey into darkness was a grim and silent procession. Guards with torches formed a tight circle around the chained creature, their faces pale in the flickering light. The Minotaur, now fully grown, was a mountain of muscle and rage. Its hooves scraped against the stone floor as it was led down into the earth through the single entrance of Daedalus's masterpiece. The last gate, a massive slab of bronze, swung shut with a final, deafening clang that echoed like a tomb ceiling, and then there was only the maze and the monster. In the absolute blackness of its center, the Minotaur was alone. Its roars were not just sounds of anger, but of profound confusion and isolation, bouncing endlessly off the identical, featureless walls. This was its world now, a universe of stone and shadow with no sky, no pasture, no mother. The creature born of a god's vengeance was left to wander an eternal puzzle, a prisoner of a sin it did not commit. Yet a king cannot simply forget a monster in his basement. The Minotaur was a living problem that required a terrible solution. To keep the beast from starving and to perhaps appease the dark forces that had created it, King Minos established a gruesome tribute. When the city of Athens, after a tragic conflict, fell under Cretan domination, Minos demanded a price for their defeat. Every 9 years, or in some versions every single year, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women across the sea. These were not slaves or soldiers, they were sacrificial offerings, the flower of Athenian youth. Upon arrival in Crete, they were cast into the labyrinth, unarmed and utterly lost. Their fate was to wander the endless corridors, torches guttering out, until they encountered the ravenous beast at its heart. The Minotaur, driven by a primal hunger, would hunt them in the dark. The labyrinth thus became more than a prison. It was a machine of death, a grinding mill that consumed human lives to sustain the king's hidden shame. This grisly cycle transformed Crete's secret into the foundation of its terror. The magnificent palace of Knossos, with its vibrant frescoes and advanced civilization, now stood atop a charnel house. The labyrinth was the dark root of the kingdom's power, a physical manifestation of Minos' broken oath, his wife's cursed desire, and his own ruthless pride. For years, this awful tribute continued, a shadow ritual that sustained the monster and cemented Minos' cruel authority. But such a system, built on injustice and fear, always creates its own weakness. It waits for a hero to hear the cries of the sacrificed, for a prince to look at the sailing ship with black sails and decide that the labyrinth and the monster within it must finally be faced. Far across the wine-dark sea, the city of Athens thrived under its own king, Aegeus. It was a proud city, a center of wisdom and competition, and it was here that the threads of fate from Crete would finally weave into a pattern of catastrophe. The connection was not a monster, but a young man, Minos' own son, Prince Androgeos. By all accounts, Androgeos was everything a king could want in an heir, strong, handsome, and gifted with a champion's grace. He traveled to Athens, perhaps on a diplomatic mission, perhaps simply for the glory of sport, to compete in the great Panathenaic festival. The games were a display of mortal excellence dedicated to the goddess Athena, featuring foot races, chariots, and brutal tests of strength. Androgeos did not just participate, he dominated. One by one, he defeated the local heroes, his victories piling up until he stood alone, crowned with olive wreaths, the undisputed champion of the festival. The Athenian crowds, initially admiring, began to murmur. This was their celebration, their home, and a foreign prince from a rival power was humiliating their best athletes. The air grew thick with a dangerous mix of envy and political anxiety. King Aegeus watched this foreign prince garner such acclaim and saw not just a talented athlete but a potential threat. A son of Minos, beloved and strong, winning the hearts of the Athenian people. In the paranoid calculus of kings, this could be the first step toward a claim, an invasion, or a shift in power. Whether by the direct order of a fearful Aegeus or through the scheming of local rivals who felt their honor was stolen, a plot was set. Androgeos, in the aftermath of his triumph, did not return to Crete in glory. On the road, perhaps ambushed during a journey, perhaps challenged to a contest meant to be fatal, the shining prince was murdered. The news that sailed back to Knossos was not a messenger of victory, but a ship carrying a father's shattered world. King Minos received the report of his son's death, and a grief so profound it turned to ice-cold fury consumed him. This was not the complicated shame of the Minotaur, a secret horror born of his own failing. This was a clear, unjust crime. His beloved son, his legacy, cut down out of petty jealousy in a foreign land. The sorrow that hollowed him out was instantly filled with a rage that demanded an ocean of blood in repayment. The king who had hidden one child in a maze of stone would now use that maze to punish an entire city for the loss of another. His grief needed a monument, and his vengeance required a ritual. He would make Athens pay a price so steep, so ongoing, and so horrific that the name of Androgeos would be remembered in every Athenian household with a shudder. The stage for the tribute was now set, not by ancient curse, but by fresh, mortal blood. The grief of a father became the engine of a war. King Minos did not merely mourn his son Androgeos, he mobilized the most formidable navy in the ancient world. The ships of Crete, swift and numerous, cut across the Aegean Sea not for trade but for vengeance. They blockaded the port of Athens, a noose of wood and sail tightening around the city. On land, the armies of Minos laid siege to the walls. The once proud city, home to philosophers and poets, began to starve. The wells ran low, the granaries emptied, and the people looked from their high walls to the endless campfires of their enemy. Defeat was not a possibility, it was an inevitability. King Aegeus, who may have ordered the murder or failed to prevent it, now faced the total destruction of his kingdom. With no hope of victory in battle, he had no choice but to send envoys to beg for terms. They approached the Cretan camp expecting harsh demands: gold, land, the surrender of weapons. What they received was a sentence far more chilling. Minos's terms were not about wealth or territory. They were about ritualized horror, a tribute designed to make Athens bleed generation after generation. The king of Crete demanded a living sacrifice. Every 9 years, or in some versions of the myth, every single year, the city of Athens would be forced to select 7 of its finest young men and 7 of its most noble young women. These 14 youths would be sent across the sea to Crete, not as prisoners or slaves, but as offerings. Their destination was not a market or a quarry. It was the entrance to the Labyrinth. Their purpose was to be given to the Minotaur. This was a punishment of exquisite cruelty. It transformed a political crime into a personal, recurring nightmare for every family in Athens. The tribute was not a tax paid from a treasury. It was a toll paid from the city's very future, its brightest and most beloved children. Imagine the dread that would descend upon the city as the 9th year drew to a close. The lottery would be held, a ceremony of pure terror where every parent prayed their child's name would not be drawn. The chosen 14 would be paraded in a grim procession to the harbor, dressed in funeral garments while the entire city mourned them as already dead. A ship with black sails, the color of mourning, would carry them away, a floating coffin on a one-way voyage. This cycle bound the fates of two cities together in a macabre dance. Athens lived under a shadow, its joy always tempered by the knowledge that the clock was ticking toward the next selection. Crete, meanwhile, secured its power not just through military might, but through supernatural terror. The Labyrinth was no longer just a hidden shame. It was a state-sponsored instrument of fear, a bottomless pit that consumed the youth of a rival civilization to feed the king's personal monster. This system, so perfectly designed to inflict maximum suffering, contained the seed of its own destruction. For a demand this monstrous does not create obedient subjects forever, it creates legends. It creates a desperate need for a hero brave enough or clever enough to walk into the maze and end the feeding. The shadow fell over Athens with a terrible, predictable rhythm. Every 9th year, as the season turned, a chilling silence would descend upon the city. It was not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of a held breath. The tribute was due. The promise made to King Minos in a moment of defeat now demanded its payment in flesh and blood. The process was designed to be a public ritual of despair. All the noble families of Athens, those with sons and daughters of a certain age, were compelled to participate in a lottery. The names of eligible youths were placed into 2 urns, one for young men, one for young women. The drawing of lots was a civic ceremony overseen by the king himself, a grotesque performance of chance where fortune was the worst possible curse. One by one, the names were pulled. With each selection, a wail would rise from the crowd as a mother collapsed or a father's face went ashen. The chosen 7 young men and 7 young women were not criminals. They were the city's future, its brightest and most beloved, now marked for a death more terrifying than any battle. For the families, the days that followed were a living funeral. Their children were dressed not for a journey but for the grave. The entire city entered a period of public mourning as if the 14 were already dead. The air was thick with the smell of burnt offerings and the sound of dirges. The final, most haunting image was the ship in the harbor. Its sails were not the white of hope or the red of war, but a profound, mournful black. This vessel was a floating coffin. The victims would walk up the gangplank in a grim procession, watched by a weeping populace lining the shore. As the black-sailed ship slipped over the horizon, it carried with it a piece of Athens' heart. This ritual transformed the Minotaur from a hidden secret in a Cretan basement into a specter that haunted all of Greece. It was no longer just King Minos' personal shame, it was his most powerful tool of tyranny. The Labyrinth became a dark engine of political control, a bottomless pit that consumed the youth of a rival city to feed the king's vengeance and display his absolute power. The cycle seemed unbreakable, a wheel of sorrow that would turn forever, grinding generation after generation into dust. Yet such profound injustice, repeated with such cruel regularity, does not foster endless submission. It forges, in the darkest of furnaces, a specific and singular kind of hero. It creates the one person who cannot bear to watch the ship sail away again. The black sails had become a symbol of Athenian despair, a promise of grief renewed with every passing cycle. But within this system of absolute hopelessness, a new force arrived in the city. His name was Theseus, and he was the king's own son, though few knew it yet. He had been raised in secret in the city of Troezen, his mother a princess, his father none other than King Aegeus of Athens himself. Aegeus had left instructions that when the boy came of age and could lift a certain rock, he should take the sword and sandals hidden beneath it and journey to his true home. Theseus did just that, but he chose the most perilous path possible, the coastal road along the Saronic Gulf. This was no simple walk. It was a gauntlet of monstrous bandits and cruel tyrants who preyed on travelers. One by one, the young hero confronted them. He met Periphetes who bludgeoned men with a bronze club, and Theseus took the club for his own. He faced Sinis the pine-bender, who tied victims to two bent pine trees and tore them apart, and Theseus gave him the same fate. He defeated the monstrous sow of Chromion and outwitted the treacherous bandit Scion, who kicked travelers off a cliff to be devoured by a giant turtle. By the time Theseus finally reached the gates of Athens, he was not just a prince, he was a legend in the making, a young man who had already cleansed the road of its terrors. He arrived in a city draped in the familiar funereal gloom. The lottery had just been held, the 14 names were known, the air was thick with the sound of weeping, and the black-sailed ship sat in the harbor like a waiting shadow. Theseus looked upon this scene, the paralyzed fear of his newfound people, and felt not despair but a rising, righteous fury. This was not justice, it was slow murder sanctioned by fear. He could not stand by and watch another group of Athenians, his people now, be led like lambs into the dark. In a moment that electrified the court, the young hero stepped forward. He declared to his father, King Aegeus, and to all the assembled nobles that he would volunteer. He would take the place of one of the chosen young men. More than that, he made a vow that seemed like madness born of arrogance. He would not go to Crete merely to die. He would enter the Labyrinth, find the Minotaur, and kill it. He would end the tribute forever. The court was stunned. Here was a solution no one had dared to propose because it was a suicide mission. The Labyrinth was inescapable. The Minotaur was invincible, yet Theseus, with the confidence of a youth who had already wrestled monsters and won, offered not just his life but a promise of liberation. His father, Aegeus, was torn between pride and terror. He begged his son not to go, but the hero's mind was set. As a final, desperate plea, Aegeus made Theseus promise one thing. The ship that carried the tribute always flew black sails, the color of mourning for those already considered lost. Aegeus made his son swear that if he succeeded, if by some miracle he survived, he would change the sails on the return voyage. He would raise white sails, a signal of victory and life. Only then would the watching king on the cliffs know his son had conquered the maze and was coming home alive. Theseus agreed. With that promise hanging between them, the prince joined the other 13 terrified youths. He walked with them onto the ship, the only one among them not weeping, his eyes fixed not on the grieving shore, but on the horizon where Crete and his destiny awaited. The harbor was a theater of silent agony. King Aegeus stood on the stone quay, the salt spray mingling with the tears he would not let his people see. He had waited a lifetime for a son, endured years of uncertainty, and now, in a single, glorious moment of reunion, he was forced to send that son to an almost certain death. The political triumph of Theseus's arrival was utterly eclipsed by this personal horror. As the young prince stood ready to board the black-sailed ship, Aegeus clutched his shoulders, his words a desperate whisper lost in the wind. He was not giving orders to a hero, he was begging a father's plea to a child. He made Theseus repeat the promise, the one fragile thread of hope he had to cling to. The king then presented his son with a second set of sails, carefully folded and stored aboard the vessel. These were not the color of mourning, but a brilliant, hopeful white. The instructions were heartbreakingly simple. If you succeed, if you conquer the monster and escape the maze, you must remember this. Take down these black sails that fly now. Hoist the white ones in their place. Let them catch the sun and shine like a beacon across the water. Only then will I know, watching from these very cliffs, that my son lives and returns to me a victor. It was a visual code, a father's desperate semaphore across the miles of open sea. For Theseus, it was one more vow in a mission filled with peril. For Aegeus, it was everything. His entire emotional world now hinged on the color of a distant piece of cloth. He would spend every day of the voyage and every day after staring at the horizon, his heart in his throat, waiting for a glimpse of sail. This simple, poignant agreement between father and son was meant to be a lifeline. Instead, it was quietly becoming the setup for a tragedy of forgotten details, where the greatest hero could be undone not by a monster's strength, but by a single human mistake. The black-sailed ship cut through the azure waters of the Cretan harbor, a stain of mourning against the bright sea. On the deck, the 14 Athenian youths stood in chains, their faces pale with a terror that had settled into a numb dread. They were marched down the gangplank not as prisoners of war, but as ceremonial offerings, a living tribute to be displayed. The path led them up from the bustling port, through streets lined with silent, watching citizens, and into the overwhelming grandeur of the palace of Knossos. The air here was scented with saffron and cedar, and the walls blazed with vivid frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful bull leapers. It was a world of sophisticated beauty, a stark and cruel contrast to the death that awaited them. In the great throne room, under a ceiling painted with spirals like stone whirlpools, they were paraded before the court. High upon a gypsum throne sat King Minos, his face an impassive mask of royal authority, but his eyes held the cold, satisfied gleam of a man whose vengeance was a well-oiled machine. Beside him, Queen Pasiphae maintained a regal stillness, but one could only wonder what storms churned behind her eyes as she looked upon these young souls destined for the maze that held her son. And among the courtiers, watching with a gaze sharper than any other, was the king's daughter, Princess Ariadne. She stood in the gilded shadow of her family's secret, a young woman for whom the labyrinth was not a myth, but a dreadful, rumbling reality beneath her feet. Her entire life had been shaped by the silent shame of the monster in the basement, by a mother's hidden grief and a father's ruthless pragmatism. She was a prisoner in a palace of lies, her future likely to be a political marriage that would further bind her to this cursed legacy. Then her eyes found Theseus. He did not stand with bowed head like the others. He stood tall, his expression one of defiant calm, his eyes scanning the room not with fear, but with the assessing look of a strategist. In that instant, something shifted within Ariadne. She did not see just another victim. She saw a man unbroken. She saw a spark of rebellion that mirrored the one smothered in her own heart. More than that, she saw possibility. This Athenian prince, bold enough to volunteer for the maze, might just be bold enough or lucky enough to do the impossible. And if he could be her ticket out. Her gaze was not one of pity, but of sudden, desperate alliance. In Theseus, Ariadne saw her one chance to escape the labyrinth of her own life, to trade a gilded cage for a world beyond the sea. A dangerous hope was kindled, and with it a plan began to form in her mind. She would need to speak to him, to offer the hero a tool for the maze, and in doing so secure her own freedom. The palace at night was a different creature, its corridors empty of courtiers but full of whispers. Ariadne moved through them like a ghost, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had arranged a secret meeting, a treasonous act that could see her exiled or worse. When she found Theseus, perhaps in a secluded courtyard or a guarded cell, the air between them crackled with urgency. She did not speak of love in those first moments, but of escape, a mutual pact born of desperation. Her offer was stark and direct. She would give him the means to conquer the labyrinth and kill the beast. In return, he must swear a solemn oath. When he left Crete victorious, he would take her with him as his wife, freeing her from her father's court and the shadow of the family monster. For Ariadne, this was not a romantic whim. It was a calculated bid for survival, a chance to trade a life of gilded dread for one of her own choosing. Theseus, facing certain death, had nothing to lose and everything to gain. He agreed. Then, from the folds of her gown, Ariadne produced her salvation package. The first item was a simple ball of thread, but in this context it was an object of profound genius. In some tellings, this clue was given to her by the master architect Daedalus himself, the man who built the trap and knew its one weakness. The plan was devastatingly simple, yet it was the only plan that could possibly work. As Theseus entered the maze, he would tie one end of the thread to the stone doorframe. Then, paying out the thread from the ball as he walked, he would venture deep into the twisting darkness. The string would lay a physical, unbroken trail behind him, a breadcrumb path made of linen or wool. No matter how many turns he took, no matter how identical the corridors seemed, this slender line would connect him directly to the outside world. After the battle, he would only have to turn around, find the thread on the ground, and follow it back, reeling it in as he went, retracing his steps with perfect certainty. This was not magic, it was practical brilliance, a way to defeat disorientation itself. The second gift varied by the storyteller. Sometimes it was a mighty sword, sharper than any bronze, to face the Minotaur's brute strength. In other, more haunting versions, it was a radiant crown forged by the god Hephaestus, a diadem that shone with an unearthly light, illuminating the pitch-black passages and blinding the creature born of darkness. With these tools in hand, Theseus was no longer a sacrificial victim. He was a hunter walking into his prey's domain, armed with a map made of string and a promise of dawn. Ariadne had given him the key to the inescapable prison, transforming a suicide mission into a calculated raid. Their pact was sealed, a conspiracy of hope against a king's tyranny and a god's cruel curse. The heavy bronze door groaned shut behind him, sealing out the last sliver of daylight and the muffled sounds of the world. Theseus stood in absolute darkness, a silence so profound it pressed against his ears. Then came the sounds of the labyrinth itself, a low, distant drip of water echoing from unseen walls, the scuttle of something small in the shadows, and his own heartbeat, loud as a drum in the stillness. The air was cold, damp, and carried the mineral scent of deep earth and old stone. He took the end of the thread Ariadne had given him, his fingers fumbling slightly in the blackness, and tied it securely around a jagged stone protrusion beside the sealed entrance. This simple knot was his only covenant with life, his sole connection to the sun, to air, to hope. With the ball of thread clutched in one hand and his sword in the other, he began to walk forward, paying out the slender line behind him. Every step was a plunge into the unknown. The corridor was narrow, the walls so close he could touch them on either side, their surfaces slick with condensation. The floor was uneven, and he had to shuffle his feet to avoid tripping. There were no torches, no braziers, no source of light whatsoever. His world shrank to the few feet ahead he could vaguely sense, and the tactile reassurance of the thread unspooling from his palm. He would come to a fork in the path, the passages looking identical in the gloom, and choose one at random, the thread laying a silent, linear history of his choices on the cold floor. The maze was designed to break the mind. He would walk for what felt like an hour, only to turn a corner and see his own thread crossing his path from a different angle, proving he had walked in a monstrous circle. The disorientation was a physical nausea. Without the thread, he would have been lost within minutes, a rat in a cosmic trap, destined to wander until his strength gave out. Then he heard it, not a roar, but a sound far more chilling in the context of the silent maze, a heavy, wet snuffling, like a great beast breathing through its muzzle. It was close, yet the echoes made it seem to come from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the ceiling, from the darkness behind his eyes. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the stone beneath his feet. The Minotaur knew he was there. It could smell him, the scent of sweat and fear and living flesh, a foreign intrusion in its lightless kingdom. Theseus stopped, his back pressed to the cold wall, and listened. The snuffling grew louder, punctuated by the slow, deliberate scrape of a hoof on stone. It was not charging, it was hunting. It was moving through its own domain with a terrible, patient certainty, knowing the maze would deliver its meal. The psychological terror became a tangible, approaching weight. The monster was no longer a story or a political tool. It was a breathing presence in the dark, and the thread in his hand was the only thing separating the hero from becoming just another set of bones in a forgotten corner. He tightened his grip on his sword, the metal suddenly feeling very small, and took another step forward, the thread unraveling into the hungry dark. The snuffling sound became a low, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very stones. Then, from a side passage so dark it was like a tear in the world, the Minotaur emerged. It was not just a beast with a bull's head. It was a mountain of nightmare-given form, a hulking silhouette that blotted out the faint, distant memory of light. Its human torso was a mass of corded muscle, slick with the damp of the maze, rising from the powerful haunches and cloven hooves of a bull. The head was pure, primal fury, with wide, dark nostrils flaring, steam puffing into the cold air with each breath. Its horns were not the polished ivory of the sacred bull, but thick, dark, and cruelly pointed, stained and scarred from a lifetime of butting stone walls. Its eyes held no human thought, no tragic awareness of its origin, only a deep, burning hunger and a rage born of endless confinement. This was the final, terrible truth of Poseidon's curse, a creature of pure instinct trapped in a stone hell of its father's making. For a heartbeat, the world was still, predator and prey locked in a silent recognition across the dark corridor. Then the Minotaur charged. It was not a run, but a terrifying, earth-shaking avalanche of muscle and bone, a force of nature funneled into the narrow stone channel. The sound was deafening, a thunder of hooves and a roar that tore through the labyrinth's silence. Theseus had no room for fancy footwork. He dove to the side, his shoulder slamming against the rough wall as the monster barreled past, a whirlwind of heat and animal stench, one horn gouging a long scar in the stone where his chest had been a moment before. The battle was not a duel of equals, but a desperate dance of opposites. The Minotaur was raw, unrestrained power, each swing of its arm capable of shattering bone, each thrust of its horns meant to impale and tear. Theseus was speed, agility, and a cunning human mind. He could not meet strength with strength. He had to be a shadow, a phantom, always moving, using the maze's own constricting walls to his advantage. He would lure the beast into charging, then sidestep at the last second, letting the Minotaur's own momentum crash it into a corner, buying himself a precious moment. In some of the oldest and most visceral tellings, the hero uses no blade. He grapples with the monster directly, using the wrestling skills honed on his journey to Athens, seeking to choke the life from it or break its neck in a supreme test of mortal will against divine-born horror. But in the version many know best, the sword Ariadne gave him finally found its purpose. As the enraged Minotaur recovered from another missed charge, twisting its massive body in the tight space, Theseus saw his opening. He did not strike at the armored skull or the thick neck. He lunged forward, driving the point of his sword deep into the monster's side between the ribs, seeking the heart or the lung. A bellow of pain and shock, more profound than anger, echoed through the labyrinth. The Minotaur staggered, its strength faltering. Theseus pulled the blade free and struck again, and again, until the great creature sank to its knees, its hot blood pooling on the cold stone floor. The final roar died into a wet, guttural sigh. Then there was silence deeper than before, broken only by the hero's ragged breathing. The Minotaur, the bull of Minos, the starry one called Asterion, was dead. In that moment, Theseus had done more than win a fight. He had severed the chain of a curse. He had liberated Athens from its gruesome tribute, and in a strange, sad way, he had liberated the monster itself from its endless, hungry, lightless prison. The labyrinth had finally been defeated, not by solving its puzzle, but by ending the reason for its existence. The victory was absolute, but the thread still lay on the ground, a slender path leading out of the darkness and back toward a world of promises, both kept and soon to be broken. The thread lay on the dark floor, a lifeline glistening faintly in the gloom. Theseus wiped his blade clean, his breath still ragged from the fight, and looked down at the thin, guiding line. It was his only way out. He did not celebrate. He simply bent down, took the thread in his hand, and began to follow it back, winding it carefully into a ball as he walked. Every turn was now a reversal of his terrifying journey inward, each loop and dead-end corridor passing by with the simple clarity of a path already walked. The labyrinth, a masterwork of confusion, was rendered powerless by a spool of string and a clear mind. He moved with a new urgency, not of a hunter but of a rescuer. He found the other Athenian youths huddled in a terrified group near the entrance where they had been left to await their fate. Their faces, pale with despair, transformed into expressions of stunned disbelief as Theseus emerged from the darkness, alive and holding the bloody proof of his victory. With a few terse commands, he gathered them and led them back along the final stretch of the thread, out through the great bronze door and into the blinding, shocking light of the Cretan afternoon. They were free, but their escape had only just begun. They moved as a single, desperate body through the winding streets of Knossos, avoiding the main thoroughfares, their hearts pounding with the fear of discovery. Every shout from a market stall, every glance from a citizen, felt like a prelude to alarm. They had to reach the harbor before King Minos learned his monster was dead and his tribute had revolted. Waiting at the appointed spot, her face a mask of anxiety and hope, was Ariadne. With her was her younger sister, Phaedra. This was not a casual addition. The princess had not come alone. Bringing Phaedra was a decisive act, a burning of bridges. It meant there was no going back for either of them, no chance to claim she had been abducted. This was a full and conscious flight. There was no time for lengthy reunions or explanations. The group scrambled aboard the Athenian ship, the very vessel that had carried them as prisoners now becoming their ark of salvation. Sailors who had expected to return with an empty, mourning ship leapt into action at Theseus's orders. Sails were unfurled, ropes cast off, and the oars bit into the water. As the ship pulled away from the dock, gaining speed, the white cliffs of Crete began to shrink on the horizon. They had done it. They had slain the beast, outwitted the maze, and stolen away the king's own daughters. But on the deck, amidst the dizzying relief, a heavy promise hung in the salt air, and a simple, crucial task was already being forgotten in the rush of triumph. The ship sailed through a sea of stars, the rhythmic splash of oars a lullaby for exhausted heroes. On the deck, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, Ariadne finally slept, her dreams perhaps filled with visions of Athenian temples and a life unchained from her father's labyrinth. The island of Naxos rose from the sea, a verdant, peaceful stop for fresh water and rest. The crew went ashore, and Theseus, with the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders, likely joined them, leaving the princess to her deep, dreamless sleep. What happened next is where the story fractures, a crack in the hero's legend that has echoed for millennia. Did Theseus, his mission complete, coldly calculate that a Cretan princess, the daughter of his enemy, would be a political burden in Athens? Did he simply forget her in his triumphant haste, his mind already racing ahead to his homecoming glory? Or was a far greater divine hand at work? The most enduring version points to the latter. As Ariadne slept, the god Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a vision or a dream. The god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness made his claim clear. Ariadne was fated for him, a divine bride, and no mortal hero could interfere with the will of an Olympian. Theseus, whether out of fear, obedience, or sudden divine compulsion, gave the order. His men silently returned to the ship, raised the anchor, and set sail, leaving the sleeping princess alone on the deserted beach. Imagine that moment of waking, the first light of dawn warming her skin, the sound of gentle waves, and then the slow, dawning horror as she sat up and saw only an empty horizon where the ship should be. The cries of gulls mocked her. She was utterly alone, abandoned on a strange shore, her great gamble for freedom ending in the cruelest betrayal. The despair must have been absolute, a crushing weight more suffocating than any palace dungeon. She had traded one labyrinth for another, this one made of open sea and broken promises, but the myths are rarely so simply cruel. As Ariadne wept on the sand, a new presence filled the air, sweet with the scent of ivy and ripened grapes. Dionysus arrived not on a ship but in a chariot drawn by panthers, his entourage of satyrs and maenads swirling around him in a joyful, chaotic dance. To the abandoned mortal princess, he offered not pity but a staggering proposal. He would take her as his immortal wife. He lifted her from the despair of mortal betrayal and placed a crown among the stars for her, the Corona Borealis. In this version, Ariadne's ending is not a tragedy but a transcendence. She ascends from a mortal heroine used as a bargaining chip by men and gods alike to become a goddess herself, worshipped and celebrated for eternity. This divine happy ending stands in stark, poetic contrast to the mortal man who left her. Theseus, in his rush toward home, had already forgotten the second, simpler promise he had made, the one about the color of the sails. The sea was a vast, forgiving blue, carrying a ship of heroes home. But on that deck, amidst the laughter and relief, a shadow was growing. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of battle, the dizzying high of survival, or a subconscious grief for the princess left behind. Perhaps in the simple, overwhelming joy of being alive, a single, crucial detail slipped from the hero's mind. Theseus had promised his father he would change the sails. He had the white ones folded and stored, a direct command from a king's breaking heart. Yet as the Attic coastline grew from a smudge to a clear line of cliffs, the sails that billowed above the triumphant ship remained a solemn, mourning black. It was a small mistake, a forgotten chore, the kind of human error that happens every day. But on this day, with this promise, it was a mistake that would echo for eternity. Far away on the high cliffs of Cape Saunion, an old man kept his daily vigil. King Aegeus had come here every single day since the black-sailed ship vanished over the horizon. He would stand for hours, his eyes straining against the glare of the sun on water, his heart a fragile thing held together by a single thread of hope. He was waiting for a speck on the horizon, a sign, a color. He was waiting for white. Then, on this day, he saw it, a ship. His old heart leapt, but as it drew closer, the shape of the sails became clear. They were not the brilliant white of victory. They were the deep, undeniable black of death. The message was unmistakable. His son, his heir, the boy he had just found and just lost, was dead. The Minotaur had won, the thread had snapped, the labyrinth had consumed his last hope. In that moment, every ounce of strength, every reason to rule, every shred of future drained from King Aegeus. The despair was not a wave, it was an ocean, and it pulled him under completely. Without a cry, without a word to his guards, he stepped forward from the high cliff and fell. A king turned into a falling shadow against the bright rock, down into the churning sea below. When Theseus's ship finally sailed into the harbor of Athens, it was to the cheers of a populace that saw a liberator. But the hero's triumph curdled into ashes the moment he learned the news. His father was dead by his own hand, killed by a son's forgetfulness. The very sea that had carried him to victory and back now bore a new and terrible name, a permanent memorial to a father's grief, the Aegean Sea. Theseus had slain the monster and freed his city, but in doing so, he had enacted the final, tragic cost of the Minotaur's curse. His victory was forever haunted, his kingship begun in personal ruin, a stark reminder that even the greatest hero is human, and that some mistakes written on the canvas of a sail can never be undone. The hero returned to a city draped in two colors, the black of mourning for a king, and the brilliant white of celebration for a liberator. Theseus, the slayer of the Minotaur, was now Theseus the king, ascending to a throne still warm from his father's tragic absence. His first act was one of profound civic healing, transforming the ship that had carried the tribute into a sacred object. He dedicated the vessel to the god Apollo, sending it on a perpetual, symbolic mission to the island of Delos. This annual voyage became a festival of remembrance and gratitude, ensuring the story of liberation would never fade from Athenian memory. But a king must do more than commemorate the past, he must build a future. Theseus looked out from the Acropolis not upon a unified city, but upon a scattered landscape of small, independent villages and strongholds, each with its own ruler and loyalties. The region of Attica was fragmented, a collection of pieces that did not yet form a whole. With the same boldness he used to enter the labyrinth, the new king embarked on a political revolution. He convinced, or in some tales compelled, the local lords and villagers to relinquish their individual sovereignty. He dissolved their separate councils and brought them all under one central government in Athens. This monumental act, known as the synoikismos, or dwelling together, transformed a loose collection of communities into the powerful city-state of Athens. It was a feat of statecraft as daring as any monster slaying, creating a political unity that would one day fuel a golden age. Yet the very qualities that made him a great hero, his impulsive action, his capacity for decisive, sweeping change, also carried the seeds of trouble. The man who forgot the white sails was a man prone to monumental oversights. The king who could unite a region could also be rash in his judgments, particularly in matters of the heart. He had returned from Crete with a second prize, Ariadne's younger sister Phaedra. She was a living link to his greatest triumph, but also a reminder of a promise broken on a Naxos beach. In Phaedra, Theseus saw not a person with her own history, but a trophy and a political alliance. Their marriage would be one of many threads in the complicated tapestry of his reign, a reign forever shadowed by the echoes of a labyrinth and the consequences of a hero's flawed humanity. King Minos' vengeance was not yet complete. The labyrinth stood empty, its monster slain, and his daughters were gone, spirited away by the Athenian prince. But the king's fury needed a final target, someone to blame for the entire catastrophe. His eyes turned to the architect of his shame, the brilliant mind behind both the wooden cow and the inescapable maze, Daedalus. The inventor had been a trusted servant, but in the king's grief-stricken view, he was the ultimate traitor. First, he had enabled the queen's unnatural desire, and then, by giving Ariadne the thread, he had directly engineered the escape of the Athenians and the princesses. Daedalus had not just built the prison, he had handed the key to the enemy. For this, Minos would show no mercy. He ordered Daedalus seized along with his young son, Icarus. Some stories say he threw them into the very labyrinth they had designed, a cruel poetic justice. Others claim he imprisoned them in a high tower overlooking the sea, a gilded cage from which escape seemed equally impossible. Either way, the message was clear. The genius who had served the throne was now its captive, and his son was a hostage to ensure his compliance. Watchtowers lined the coast, and every ship was searched. Minos controlled the land and the sea. For a normal man, this would have been the end, but Daedalus was not a normal man. Staring out from his prison at the endless sky and the guarded waters, he conceived a plan of breathtaking audacity. If the earth and sea were closed to him, he would claim a third domain. He would escape through the air, gathering feathers that fell from birds and bribing guards for candles to collect wax. Daedalus set to work on his greatest and most dangerous invention. He fashioned 2 pairs of wings, carefully layering the feathers from small to large and binding them together with thread before sealing the whole structure with wax. These were not magical, they were mechanical, a masterpiece of early engineering mimicking the birds he observed. When they were finished, he fitted the wings to his own shoulders and then to his son's. His instructions were solemn and precise. They must fly a middle course, fly too low, and the damp sea spray would clog the feathers and weigh them down. Fly too high, and the heat of the sun would melt the wax that held their wings together. The path to freedom was a narrow corridor between 2 deadly extremes. Father and son fastened their wings, took a running start from their prison wall, and leapt into the open sky. For the first time in history, men were flying. The feeling must have been pure exhilaration, a dizzying rush of freedom as the island of Crete shrank beneath them and the vast horizon opened up. But that freedom carried a terrible price, one that would forever change the meaning of their flight. The empty labyrinth beneath Knossos was sealed, but the story it contained refused to stay buried. It echoed outward, becoming more than a simple monster tale, evolving into one of humanity's most enduring metaphors. At its core, the Minotaur represents the monstrous consequence of breaking sacred laws. a living testament to what happens when human arrogance and unnatural desire run unchecked. It is the other, the hybrid creature that violates the boundaries of nature, but it is also tragically a prisoner, a being born without consent into a life of confinement and rage. This duality is what gives the myth its lasting power. The monster is both the punishment and a victim of the punishment, forcing us to ask who the real beast in the story might be. Long before the Greeks wrote of Theseus, the people of ancient Crete were already fascinated by the power of the bull. The magnificent frescoes from the palace of Knossos do not show a monster, but something equally daring, the ritual of bull leaping. In these vibrant images, young athletes, both male and female, are shown gracefully vaulting over the backs of charging bulls. This was likely a sacred sport, a test of courage and agility that honored the bull's immense power rather than sought to destroy it. The bull in Minoan culture was a symbol of potency and divine authority, a far cry from the cursed horror of the later myth. When the Mycenaean Greeks conquered Crete, they inherited these powerful images but filtered them through their own worldview of order versus chaos. On later Greek vases, we see the story shift. The art now depicts the moment of confrontation, Theseus poised with his sword against the raging Minotaur, a clear visual metaphor for civilization conquering primal savagery. The myth's resonance only deepened with time, finding new life in the modern imagination. In psychology, the labyrinth becomes a powerful symbol for the tangled pathways of the human subconscious, a maze of repressed memories, hidden fears, and unresolved desires. The Minotaur waiting at the center represents our own personal demons, the aspects of ourselves we fear to face, the inherited traumas or shameful secrets we keep locked away. To enter the labyrinth in this reading is to embark on a journey of self-discovery, and the thread of Ariadne becomes the guiding light of reason, love, or therapy that can lead us back out. Literature and film have continually returned to this blueprint, from the surreal landscapes of Borges to the dystopian cityscapes of science fiction. The idea of an inescapable maze with a terrifying secret at its heart remains a compelling framework. It speaks to our universal anxiety about being trapped, lost, or having to confront a terrifying truth. Ultimately, the legacy of the Minotaur is the legacy of a story that contains multitudes. It is a thrilling adventure of a hero's quest. It is a profound tragedy of a cursed family. It is a stark warning about the cost of broken oaths. And it is an intimate allegory for the courage it takes to walk into our own darkest places, to face the Minotaur we harbor within, and to find the thread that can guide us back into the light. The roar from the labyrinth may have been silenced, but the questions it raises continue to echo, as relevant now as they were 3,000 years ago. The tale of the Minotaur is not a single act of horror, but a chain reaction of divine wrath and human failing. It began with a king's broken oath when Minos chose greed over gratitude and kept Poseidon's sacred bull. That single act of arrogance invited a punishment of poetic cruelty, twisting the queen's heart with an unnatural desire. From that cursed union, the monster Asterion was born, a child of two worlds condemned to a life of darkness and rage. His prison, the brilliant, terrible labyrinth, became a machine of death, consuming Athenian youth to sustain a king's secret shame. And into that darkness walked Theseus, armed with a thread and a promise, who ended the beast's torment and freed a city, yet whose own forgetfulness forged a final tragedy in the Aegean Sea. This myth endures because it refuses simple answers. It asks us who the real monster is, the beast in the maze or the king who put him there. It shows us that heroism, however glorious, carries a profound and human cost. And it reminds us that the consequences of a broken promise can echo for generations, twisting fate into shapes of both terror and awe. So we turn to you. Which moment in this shocking saga resonated most deeply? Was it the chilling creativity of Poseidon's revenge, the tragic fate of Pasiphae, or the high price of Theseus's victory? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to continue unraveling the tangled threads of fate, gods, and heroes, subscribe for more deep dives into the unforgettable stories of Greek mythology.